right, let's look at the Louisiana Real Estate Commission purchase agreement, page 3. Page 3. Let me share my screen here. All right, here we go. Page 3. Remember, you've got the date, the property address, and the date at the top. So the first line here, occupancy. This is when does the buyer take occupancy of the property? So they go to closing, we close, it's noon. It is their property, the buyer's property. They now have possession of it. In most cases, that's when occupancy starts at the closing, at the completion of the closing. All keys and remotes and everything that goes with the house is to be given to the buyer at that point. Anything after the closing and the occupancy is changed over or executed, no one else from the seller side needs to go back on the property or go in the house or anything like that. Is not their house anymore. So know that if there's any special circumstances where occupancy is not going to be granted at the closing, then there is additional documents, occupancy prior to closing or occupancy after closing. There's two separate documents, and the best way to do it is when you close, occupancy is given, and there's no lingering occupancy issues. Just transfer the keys at closing, and that's it. If you have a different situation to that, or want to talk through some scenarios, we can do that. You talk with the staff or me. Certainly call me and ask me, and we'll talk about it. All right, contingency. All right, here we go. So the contingency for the sale of the buyer's other property. So in some cases, you have a buyer who is trying to buy a property, and in order to do that, they want to or have to sell a current property that they own. Typically, it's because they have a mortgage and the lender will not approve them for the next mortgage on the new house unless they sell the old house. So in that case, your client, in order to represent them properly, you're going to check the box here that the sale is contingent upon the sale of another property. So when you do that, this talks about contingency language found either in the lines later in the purchase contract here, which 343 to 352, or an attached addendum. My advice to you is do not start creating legal language. We're not trained in that. We're not experts. It's outside of our expertise. The board of realtors that we belong to have had their attorneys look at this stuff and create an addendum. So when we look at a situation where we need a contingency, here's that form right here. You would fill this form out. There's actually 3 pages. The first page of this is the page that you would fill out and attach to the offer and send over to the listing agent. Later in the process, there's a page 2 that handles a situation where you're under contract and the seller gets another offer they want to accept. Then they get to notify, the sellers are going to use this form to notify your buyer client that they either need to remove the contingency or give up the right to purchase the house, cancel the purchase agreement. So we can talk about that a little further, but just know that this is a play where the seller is going to come and they're ready to sell it to somebody else because your buyer hasn't been able to remove the contingency. In addition, there's a page 3. So page 3 is if your buyer receives notice from the seller that they want to sell it to somebody else, and they've asked your buyer to remove the contingency or let the property go, this 3rd page is where your buyer responds. So the response is either to remove the contingency, and or response number two is release the property back to the seller, remove all conditions, get your deposit, get the buyer's deposit back, and let the seller move on and sell it to someone else. So just know that this paperwork's in available, and it needs to be attached. Page one of those three needs to be attached to the purchase offer, and you're either going to choose box A that says your client's property is currently under contract and scheduled and has a scheduled closing, so that the seller has more belief that that you're going to get your property, the buyer's going to get their property sold, and they'll be able to buy their house. Otherwise, you have checkbox B, and it has a little bit different language that the seller authorizes their agent, the listing agent, to continue to market the property during the period that your buyer client has the contingency in place, and at any time the seller receives an offer that they deem acceptable, then here the seller is going to give you that notice we talked about a second ago. That notice is going to come in, and your buyer's going to have either 48 or 72 hours. I mean, put 72, that's the longest period probably that I've seen. That's 3 full days. So put 72 hours. If the listing agent doesn't like that, they can counter back with 48 or something. But if you put less than 72 and the notice comes in on Friday night, well, that's Friday night, that's Saturday night, Sunday night, and it gives you Monday to get with your bank, and for your buyer to get with the bank and go, hey, can I remove this contingency, or do I have to let this thing go? They may be able to work something out on Monday. But if it's 48 hours in that scenario, the buyer's going to have to make a decision before the end of Sunday night, and it can make it more difficult. So in the situation, I would want to have 72 hours so my buyer would have time, depending on when that contingency removal notice came in. They would have time to talk with their loan officer or lender or whoever else they want to talk to about a different way to go about purchasing the property. But you fill this out, check either A or B, and then get it fully signed and sent over to the seller with the attached purchase agreement. So I'm gonna flip down. When I say it's attached, when this thing on line 55 says attached addendum, let's go look at where you're going to also specify that it's attached. So anytime you attach an addendum, you have to show that here on lines 371 through 374. So in this case, line 371 has a checkbox that says a contingency for the sale of the buyer's property addendum. So you would check this box, and you would check the box that we were looking at earlier up in the purchase agreement. You would fill out the contingency addendum form, page 1, and you would check this box right here that you're adding that addendum to this offer. Okay. So, along with any other addendums that you're going to use later. So let's just know that you have to check off a box down here. We'll go back over that in a little bit when we get there. All right, let's see. We've got page 3, and that was here. So if the sale is not contingent, then you would just check this off. Say your buyer doesn't need to sell a property, then you would check this box, and they don't have to sell anything, and you're just making that disclosure to the seller. A lot cleaner with no contingency, but unavoidable sometimes, and you need to use the contingency addendum. All right, let's check here on the financing. So this section line 60 financing. There is an option here for if they're paying all cash, check this box. The buyer warrants the buyer has cash readily available to close the sale of this property. In some cases, this is a guarantee by contract that the buyer has the money. In some cases, you're going to have agents who want to see some type of good funds letter. I guess the only thing I could say is that's fine. We can try to get that, or we can provide that. It's really spelled out right here. The buyer by contract says they have the money. They can go get a letter from the bank, but that money's only in the bank at the moment they got the letter. Tomorrow, the next day, they could pull all that money out, and now there's no money. But this overrides all of that. And the buyer says he has the cash readily available. There's no way to misunderstand that. If the buyer's going to do financing, there's some critical points here. I would check this box, and then I would come in here and I would put the percent of loan to value that the buyer is going to get the loan for. So in most cases, this might be they're going to get 100% financing. So I would put 100% here. It might be a VA or a rural development loan, and they're getting 100%. I typically don't write in cash amounts here. I just do it by the percentage option here. So you could write in 100% or just put 100% right here. If they're doing an FHA loan, that means they're going to borrow. They're going to have to come to the table with 3.5%. So that makes this number, this blue box, you're going to write 96.5%, the balance of what they're going to get the loan for, and so on. 80%, 20% down. That means they're going to get an 80% loan. I would put 80% in this box. Okay. Moving through. At an initial rate not to exceed. Typically, I'm looking for what the loan officer is telling me their interest rate's going to be, and if the interest rate's going to be 5.5, then I would put about a half point higher. I would put 6% right here, so that it acts like a protective ceiling. If the rates went from 5.5 to 6, the buyer's still good. The deal's still moving forward. If it goes to 7%, then the buyer has a decision. They can either back out because 6% was the maximum that they agreed to get a loan for, or they could choose to go higher, whatever they want to do there. But it's a protective ceiling in case market rates go kind of nuts all of a sudden. And then whatever the loan's going to be amortized over, is it going to be 30 years, 20 years, 15 years? Again, the conversation with your buyer and the loan officer, that's where you're going to get these numbers, this information for the finance section. You're going to make sure you're getting that information from them and just putting it here. You would check off what type of loan they're going to get. Be accurate. Fixed rate mortgage. Also, I would check off if it was a rural development, if it was a conventional or FHA, VA. Those are the typical ones. I don't use these other ones ever. I've never used them. They can be used. I just don't run into it very much. It's not normal. It's certainly special situations. If you run into somewhere where you're going to be doing owner financing or bond financing, let's have a one-on-one discussion and get the right people to explain what those types of programs are going to be to your buyer. So lastly here, line 76, you've got the information here about does the buyer agree to pay any discount points? Typically, I don't have anything here because the buyer may pay some discount points, but that's really just between the lender and the buyer, and that just shows up on their closing statement. This could be, if rates really went way up, 10, 11, 12%, I would think this could become important. Even asking the seller to pay some discount points, so we would have to look at that by exception, but I typically don't use this because it doesn't matter to the seller at this point. If the buyer's paying discount points, then they just handle that in the loan paperwork. The last thing about this section right here is this other financing conditions. Here's where I would put something if the buyer is asking the seller to contribute towards their closing cost. So let's say the buyer's coming to the table with 5% down, and they in order to get the loan done, they need 5%, but they still need money to pay for their closing costs. Typical lender fees and title fees and their prepaid insurances and taxes. So in this section, let's say we talk to the lender and the buyer, and they agree that they need $4,000 from the seller to pay towards the buyer's closing costs and prepaids in order to help facilitate the sale and help the buyer with the cash they need at closing. So in this, I would write seller to pay up to $4,000 towards the buyer's closing cost and prepaids. The seller to pay up to $4,000 towards the buyer's closing cost and prepaids. Write that down somewhere so you know how to craft that language. All right, the rest of this section, again, read this section, understand what it's talking about. But the one thing I really want to put emphasis on here is this requirement for the buyer to provide the seller with a letter. So the buyer shall supply the seller written documentation from the lender. So the buyer shall supply the seller with a letter from the lender that says the loan application has been made and the buyer has given the lender written authorization to proceed with the loan approval process within X number of days of this contract acceptance. Typically, I would put 7 days in here. That's a full, that's a full calendar week. So basically, what the buyer is saying is, within 7 days, I'm going to choose my lender and sign the formal loan application, which gives the lender authorization to proceed with loan approval. And for doing that, the lender needs to write a little, one paragraph letter. We have that language available. We can send out whatever. If you need it, ask me. But I think most lenders know what this is by now. But the lender provides a letter on their letterhead that says the buyer has given the seller written authorization to proceed with loan approval. That's it. It's simple. But the contract specifies that has to be done. What's interesting is if the buyer doesn't do that, the seller has the option to terminate the agreement and declare the agreement null and void. And then once that's done, they would send the buyer's deposit back and they would move on and accept some other offer that they might be lingering out there or somebody might be waving around in front of them. So be sure that you're watching these timelines and that this is a very important piece of the puzzle, that your buyer gets this letter to the seller within the correct number of days here, and that's settled and everybody knows they got it. Okay. Last thing we'll talk about on page 3 is the proration here of other costs. So at the closing, you're going to have real estate taxes that are due. You're going to have some other maybe homeowners associations information that was due. There may be some other assessments or something that's been paid or not, are going to be paid later. Whatever those other costs are, let's just talk about real estate taxes right now for the example. So real estate taxes, if we close the property on June 30th, that's 6 months. So the first half of the year's passed. The seller lived in the property the first half of the year. and the buyer's going to live in the property the second half of the year. So the seller has to give the buyer the first 6 months worth of property taxes. And then at the end of the year, the buyer just pays it all because they got half the money already from the seller, and then they put up the other half because they lived in it the second half. So it's going to be prorated, but it's going to be mostly things like real estate taxes and maybe HOA dues are the things I see the most. Every once in a while, there's some kind of insurance, maybe flood insurance being transferred that could be prorated. But just know that other costs can be prorated. So that's the end of page 3. Remember, buyer initials, etc. And we'll see you on page 4.